I've just been reading a fantastic new piece of research about female leadership. This shows you why history is so exciting, of course. Steven Pinker, one of the sort of vox pop type historians or writers, he wrote recently saying that women should be put in charge of everything because there'd be much less conflict. Which sounds, I suppose, that sounds entirely plausible to me. Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History in the early 90s, I think we've all probably got to the point where no one can really see liberal democracy on the move anymore. Maybe it'll come back. But he also threw his hat in that same ring, saying that women would help calm things down. If the patriarchy, the less men fight, the less there are men in power, then the better, more conciliated the world is. In fact, those are all perfectly good statements. Those are the kind of things that we would all throw across at each other at the dinner party. The financial crisis wouldn't have happened if there'd been more women fund managers. Maybe it's true. But what historians want to do, like scientists, is they want evidence. And there's a terrific new piece of work produced looking at female leadership in between 1400 and 1900. And women leaders, for lots of different complex reasons, there are lots of ways in which one can understand why, turn out to be much more volatile, much more aggressive when it comes to deciding to launch wars. So in fact, however counterintuitive that might seem, however strange it might seem, using evidence to try to push away these kind of ideas that settle in our head, that somehow we in Europe, those who've read my book, will know that the idea that we in Europe are the beacon of all light and joy and goodness is not entirely wrong, but it does need to be qualified. This is a continent that has had more bloodshed and more warfare than all the others put together. There wasn't a single decade between 1350 and 1950 that didn't involve a major war between European powers, often not even in Europe itself. Those kinds of ideas. So when Richard Dawkins, I don't know if he's here, said, well, Muslims have won less Nobel Prizes than Trinity College, Cambridge. Well, that's true, but the correlation must be about when were the Nobel Prizes founded. And as an academic, we all need funding to be able to do our research. We need money, and we need patrons. And for the last 300-400 years, by far the richest parts of the world have been those of Western Europe in particular. So it's not surprising that scholars and scholarship are drawn to centers like Oxford, Cambridge, increasingly now Harvard, Yale, Chicago, etc., where you're able to build scholarly environments. So I think that history can do some of those things to recalibrate ideas that we might throw around too easily. And speaking up for my brethren in the Bodleian Library today, it's the middle of finals, every single desk is taken. The kinds of things that we all talk about is, where are women in history? Where are the non-elites? Where are the illiterate? Where are the regions, the peoples who don't get written about and don't get talked about? Well, we do write a lot about those. Perhaps, and Martin Luther would have agreed with that, he'd have said sometimes we behave too much like a priesthood and only share our ideas with each other. Well, I can tell you that's not for lack of trying. We do all write articles, books, but we need more people to read all of those. So that's a sort of weak appeal, I suppose, to say one of my theses would be to cast our nets slightly wider. I suppose another area to go for, yes, which is, I suppose, dovetails into lazy assumptions, or sort of things we think we know, is to look at the world in a wider and perhaps different way. You all here at Hay today, the brightest and the best, the elite, the SAS of festival audiences, everybody knows that Hay is the big one. So to even get a ticket here, I don't know how hard that must be. But you'll all know that the first novel ever written was written in Japanese, and you'll know that the first novel ever written also happened to be written by a woman in the 11th century. You'll know that the first narrative history was also written by a woman in the 12th century, as it happened. This in medieval florid Greek. Very complicated. I translated this for Penguin Classics. Our ideas about women, about class, about regions, about narrative styles, we can become very lazy to think that we are the center of everything. And that narcissism is something that Luther would have understood and gone for. He used to say that the Pope, he spread fake news like anything, by the way. He said the Pope was a transvestite, used to wear women's clothes, spent his whole time vomiting up devils. But these ideas, I think, are important, and particularly important for other parts of the world. For example, George Osborne was talking when he was when he was Chancellor about how Britain should be proud to be commemorating the ending of slavery. Well, Ashoka abolished slavery in the 3rd century BC. Slavery was abolished by the Qin dynasty and by the Qin dynasty 2,000 years ago in China. Even in Europe, in Croatia, it was abolished in 1214. So these ideas that we are always first to the party, we should understand our own history, we should look at ourselves, is always, I think, very tricky. That Western focus is something that can handicap us. And I've tried my best with my Silk Roads book and the work that I do as a Byzantine historian to try to shift the geographical balance, to try to explain how things are tied together, how we're connected, and perhaps how we might look at history in an objective, slightly different way. But I can tell you it's not easy to do that. You need to speak and be able to read many, many, many languages. You need to be able to handle complex materials, not just written materials. Those we understand. We understand that reading texts from the past, it's like handling the Daily Mail today, or the Guardian, or complicated pieces of information. But you also have to understand how the basis of archaeology functions. You need to understand about coins, numismatics. You need to understand about exchanges, about exchange rates, which of course happened and were important thousands of years ago too. So it's difficult to write big global histories that tie us all together, particularly over long periods, wide regions, and so on. And I suspect there will be more of those written now that the Silk Roads has become such a visible book. So one of the things, I suppose, is to try to provide a greater context in my thesis, to try to look away from just this region, to not just think about French novelists and Italian composers and German philosophers and so on, because we know this continent quite well. It's ironic that although we know it quite well, we're spending a great deal more time picking apart at our wounds and trying to build separation than we are looking at continuities. Because the thing that I'm most interested in as a historian are connections. I'm most interested in stability, because stability brings prosperity and it brings tolerance. And the problem when you study the Reformation, when you study the First World War, you study the Second World War, you study the Wars of the Roses, all of these topics that sound very similar, by the way, they're always about warfare. They're always about moments where people have chosen or decided that there's no better option than to fight and to kill each other. And that's terrifying because, of course, we should be trying to work out and look at those moments where things are stable, where people don't fight, where people learn how to cooperate. And that's why the great empires that I like to look at, she's coming, are about things like the Byzantine Empire that lasted for more than 1,000 years. Multi-regional, multi-ethnic, multilingual, was able to deliver justice equitably because a state that is unjust fails. Was able to collect taxes in an efficient way because a state that can't tax either successfully or proportionately fails. And I would look at the Mongol Empire, the largest empire built in human history, or large land empire, I should say, built in human history, that for all of the things that we think about the Mongols, about Genghis Khan, who gets all of the credit, by the way, when his sons did all the hard work. I tell my father that often. He gets a lot of the credit. He died before the really big stuff happened. The Mongols managed to unite a landmass that connected Central Europe from Hungary right the way through to the Korean peninsula. I look at the Ottomans, that again we deride as being the sick man of Europe because we only look at the last bit where the Ottoman Empire starts to crumble and fade. And as it happens, the big talk on the street in Ankara in Istanbul today is, well, maybe the Ottomans didn't do such a bad job after all in places like Syria and Iraq, which were, of course, essential provinces of the old Ottoman Empire. We'll talk about that a bit too. So I think that these ways of looking at history are hugely important. But in terms of what I think that the key area to reform is how we look at history, and by that I mean the humanities, because of course history is the queen of the subjects. I'm always asked what faculty I'm in at Oxford, but there's no difference to me between theology and history, or geography and history, or language and history, or literature and history. Increasingly, actually, there's no real difference between science and history, because the most exciting stuff that I'm looking at are things like, just this week, looking at new data from ice cores that show levels of lead production at the time of the Black Death, where mining stops. We can chart that. The amount of metal in the atmosphere stops. Our ability to create any form of manufacturing is destroyed by pandemic. And that seems to me both quite useful in using modern science to help better configure and understand an interesting part of the past. If like me, you think that one of the reasons you study history is also to understand the present day, and perhaps to prepare for the future, well, even Bill Gates, I don't know, I say even Bill Gates, who knows more about things like malaria than almost anybody because of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has been warning about the dangers we face of pandemics. I was in Shanghai a few weeks ago, and there were new strains of bird flu that had killed 30 people. It doesn't get reported over here because that's no longer a threshold to get the newspapers excited. But if and when there is some form of new pestilence, whether it's man-made, whether it's artificial, whether it's spread by nature, whether it's an evolutionary virus, that remains to be seen, but it's important to understand what kind of effects these have.